The next type that I want to look at is type aliases, and this is very useful mostly in development, and it's very good for readability. So let me show you an example. So when you're trying to find a type alias, you type the word type, and then let's say I'm defining an ID, so I'm going to do ID, and usually you do that in uppercase if it's a simple word like this. So here I can say this type can be a number. I can leave it like that, and that would work just fine. And then I can go down here, and then I can say let customer ID, for example, and then I say this is of type ID, and that's my variable declaration. So now you can see that this is not really doing anything. I could have just put the type number here and not ID, but what it gives me as a developer is an explicit name that you can see here, which is an ID. So it's good for readability and code understanding in the development process. Or I can just say this can also be a string. So you can see that this ID now, it's very useful. I can hover over it. It's going to give me the type alias definition, as you can see here. But now I can look at this piece of code and I can understand that, okay, the customer ID is some kind of ID. And then we can go down below and then we can say customer ID, of course, and that can be a string or a number. So I can say 99, for example, and I can go down, I can do customer ID again, and then set it equal to a string. Let's say some character with a number or something. That's the user ID now. And that works just fine. And we can also do a more complex example. So let's do type, and let's say this is going to be a rectangle type. So we're going to say rectangle, and that's going to be an object. So we're going to do equal and then opening and closing curly braces. And let's say this has a length property, and this is going to be a number. And I don't want to do width because that's going to give you another number. So let's say the rectangle has a name. So we're going to do name, and that's going to be a string. So this is a type that I define. And then I can say let my room, for example, which is a rectangle type. So I can do rectangle, and you can see that that works just fine. So you can see how useful this can be. Mostly in development, you're very explicit with what you're doing with the code and what you're trying to define. So later down, I can say my room and then set it equal to an object. And there's going to be a length property, let's say 88, and then a name. I don't know. I don't give my room a name. Let's say room name for the sake of it. So room name. So you can see that this works just fine because we define this alias as an object with two properties, the length and the name. And you can see that we define it as a type alias that we assign to this variable my room, which is a rectangle. So the point is, doing it that way is a lot better than doing it this way that we did with the object type. So that works just fine. We don't get any errors, and everything would work fine. If I console log the room, you will see that it's going to be just an object with two properties. And I can show you that real quick. So I can do console.log and then my room. Go ahead and run the code. And you can see we have the object printed. But it's a lot better when we do it this way, because now we're not looking at an object with, two properties. We're actually looking at an actual name that as humans we can recognize. And that's just an example of a situation where you would use a type alias that you see that I define up here. So you do the keyword type, and then you give the name of the alias, and then you define the type that you want. That can either be a primitive type, as you can see we're doing above, can be a union of primitive type, or a union of primitive and an object type. It can be any type, whatever you define. And then you can use it in your variable like this, and you can see that this line here on line 11, that makes a lot more sense than doing something like an object type like I just showed you, like if I were to do it this way. So I'm going to revert that back. So I hope by now you see the advantage of using the type alias in your code. But to be honest, I usually use an interface instead of a type alias because in my project I would have different files and things like that. So I'm not going to be defining a type up above my files like this. I would probably define some interface, and I would try to combine data that belongs together. So instead of having this, rectangle here, I would probably have an interface and probably have more properties than just these two properties. But it exists in TypeScript. If you can find a good use for it, then go ahead and use it. But in my experience, I usually don't use the type alias. I use an interface instead.